All right, so welcome to another Deep Dives. You know how this works. You send us something you're interested in, and we take a look at it, try to pull out the most interesting bits, and have a good chat about it. It's like we're doing the hard work of getting informed so you don't have to.
And today we're diving into something I think everyone can relate to. Disagreements, arguments, those moments when you're trying to convince someone of your point of view. We're looking at this book, Learn to Win Arguments and Succeed by Vishal Gupta.
Okay, so winning arguments. Sounds a little combative, maybe, but I guess the book is assuming that's like a universal goal, right?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, who doesn't want to feel like they can hold their own in a disagreement? But the book's not really about, like, crushing your opponent. It's more about understanding the dynamics of arguments.
Right. So what does Gupta say about what an argument actually is?
Well, he's very clear about his definition. He sees an argument as a situation where, two or more people have different opinions, and they're actively trying to convince each other that their view is the correct one.
Okay, so it's different from just a friendly discussion where you're like exploring different ideas.
Exactly. A discussion is more about mutual understanding, trying to see things from different perspectives. But an argument, according to Gupta, is about, well, trying to win.
And he says we have these kinds of arguments like how often?
Five or six times a day on average.
Seriously. Wow, I would never have guessed that.
Right. It makes you think about all those little disagreements we have, with family, with friends, at work.
So, like, what are some of the situations he talks about?
Well, he gives a whole bunch of examples. Like, think about disagreements with your parents, when you're younger and wanting to do things your own way.
Right, the classic teenage rebellion.
Exactly. Or arguments within a marriage or a partnership, those little negotiations about space, control, that kind of thing.
And then there's, like, disagreements with friends, right? Like if a friend is constantly being negative or putting you down.
Yeah, yeah. And Gupta talks about how important it is to be able to stand up for yourself in those situations, to protect your self-esteem, basically.
Right, to counter that negativity. And then there's, disagreements with your boss, with elders, with strangers, even those big debates on like social media or whatever.
Exactly. He covers all those bases. And the idea is that these 20 techniques he lays out, they can help you navigate all these different types of arguments.
Okay, so I'm curious about the techniques themselves, but first, like, what's his overall philosophy on arguments? I mean, does he believe there's always a right and wrong answer?
Well, that's an interesting point. He actually argues that the world is kind of based on this idea of duality. There's
Right.
not always a clear right and wrong. Almost every issue has at least two sides.
So, like, even in an argument, both sides could have valid points.
Yeah, that's what he's saying. And that's why he believes every argument has, like, a winning side and a losing side.
But how can you, like, win an argument if there's not always a right answer?
It's not so much about finding the absolute truth as it is about, effectively presenting your perspective and influencing the other person.
Okay, so it's more about, like, persuasion strategy.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, he uses some pretty controversial examples. Like, he even talks about terrorism.
Wow, that's a pretty extreme example.
Yeah, it is. But his point is that even viewpoints that most of us find completely abhorrent are often fiercely defended by those who hold them. It's a reminder that everyone sees things from their own perspective and believes that they're right.
Okay, so these techniques are like tools for navigating that clash of perspectives.
Exactly. And with that, why don't we dive into the first technique?
All right, let's do it. What's number one?
Technique number one is called repeat and repeat and repeat.
Okay, so that sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it is on the surface. Basically, the idea is that if your opponent is coming at you with a bunch of arguments and you only have one really strong point on your side, you just keep repeating that point over and over.
Really, even if it feels like you're like ignoring their other points.
Yep. You might phrase it in different ways, to keep it from sounding too repetitive, but the key is to hammer away at that one strong point until they kind of run out of steam.
So it's almost like you're wearing them down.
Exactly. The idea is that eventually they'll either get tired of trying to argue against your point or they'll be forced to confront it head on, which, if it's a really strong point, can be difficult to do.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say you're having a discussion about nuclear energy.
Hmm?
Your friend is listing all the benefits, no pollution, potential for cheap energy, things like that.
Right, and you're like not convinced.
Exactly. And your main concern is, what if there's a disaster, like a meltdown or something? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, that's a pretty big concern.
So according to this technique, you would just keep bringing that point up. But what about the risk of a disaster? Are we really prepared for that? What happens if something goes wrong?
And your friend, they might try to downplay the risk, but you just keep going back to that one point.
Exactly. Eventually, they'll either run out of counterarguments or the conversation will shift to focus on that one crucial issue, which is what you wanted all along.
Okay, I can see how that could be effective. So what's technique number 2?
Technique number 2 is silence speaks.
Silence. So, like, not saying anything at all.
Yep. This one's all about knowing when to just shut up.
That sounds a little counterintuitive. I mean, usually in an argument, you want to, like, defend yourself, right?
Right. But sometimes the best defense is no defense at all. If you're in a situation where you know you're wrong or you just don't have a good argument, sometimes the smartest thing to do is just stay quiet.
Hmm.
Hmm?
I guess that could prevent you from making things worse, huh?
Exactly. And sometimes the other person might even start to feel bad about how they're acting, especially if you're not giving them any fuel for the fire.
What kind of situation would this work in?
Okay, let's say you forgot to pick up groceries for, like, a big party your wife is throwing. And she's, understandably upset. She might even be yelling at you.
Oh, yeah, been there.
So in that moment, instead of trying to make excuses or getting defensive, you just stay quiet.
Just take it.
Yep. Let her vent. And who knows, maybe later on she'll realize she overreacted a bit and she might even apologize.
So it's like a gamble, but sometimes it pays off.
Exactly. Gupta points out that this is especially true in relationships, where emotions can run high. Sometimes logic goes out the window and silence can be more powerful than words.
Interesting. Okay, what about technique number 3?
Technique number 3 is called praise, disagree.
Okay, so is this like the honey catches more flies than vinegar approach?
You could say that. It's about being diplomatic, especially when you're disagreeing with someone you respect, like an elder or a person in a position of authority.
So how does it work?
You start by agreeing with them, but then you immediately follow it up with your disagreement.
Like, I see your point, but kind of thing.
Exactly. And the key is to use positive language and a respectful tone. It's all about softening the blow of your disagreement.
So, like, if you were arguing with a doctor who swears by conventional medicine and dismisses, say, homeopathy.
Yeah, you could say something like, I understand your perspective, doctor, and I respect your expertise in allopathic medicine, but I've also had positive experiences with homeopathy.
So you're acknowledging their authority, but still presenting your own viewpoint.
Right. It's about finding that balance. And Gupta stresses that the initial agreement doesn't have to be completely genuine. It's more about creating a more receptive atmosphere.
I see. So it's like a strategic move. All right, what's the next technique?
Technique number 4 is also called praise, disagree. But this one is a bit more, manipulative, you could say.
Oh, how so?
So this time, you praise the person for their intelligence or some other positive quality, and then you immediately present your disagreement in the form of a question that kind of challenges their intelligence.
So it's like, you're so smart, but why would you say something like that?
Exactly. The idea is to create a bit of cognitive dissonance. They're being praised, but then their own words are being used to question that praise.
Okay, that's pretty sneaky.
Yeah, it can be. But, sometimes you gotta play dirty.
So give me an example.
Let's say your teenage son comes to you and says he wants to drop out of school.
Oh, well, that's a tough one.
Right. So using this technique, you might say something like, son, you are so intelligent, so bright, you have so much potential. Why would someone as smart as you want to throw it all away? Don't you want to go to college and, invent something amazing?
So you're appealing to his ego, but also subtly challenging his decision.
Exactly. He's being told he's smart, but then he has to reconcile that with his desire to drop out of school. It creates a bit of a mental conflict.
Okay, I can see how that might make him rethink things. What's technique number 5?
Technique number 5 is faulty presumptions.
Faulty presumptions. What does that mean?
So every argument is based on certain assumptions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things that are taken for granted, even if they're not explicitly stated. This technique is all about identifying those assumptions and pointing out if they're wrong or shaky.
So, like, if someone says, Brazil is definitely going to win the World Cup, they're making a lot of assumptions.
Exactly. They're assuming that Brazil's team is strong, that they won't have any injuries, that they'll perform well on the day, and so on.
And you could point out that those assumptions might not be true.
Right. You could say, well, what if their star player gets injured? Or what if they have a bad day and don't play to their potential?
Okay, I get it. So it's about, like, exposing the weaknesses in their argument by questioning their underlying assumptions.
Exactly. And sometimes those assumptions can be so deeply ingrained that the person making the argument doesn't even realize they're making them.
What's the next technique?
Technique number 6 is statistics and expert opinion.
Okay, that one sounds pretty straightforward.
It is. It's basically about using data and the opinions of experts to back up your arguments. People are more likely to believe something if it's supported by evidence, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So let's say you're having a discussion about, I don't know, the happiest countries in the world, and your friend insists that it must be the United States because, they're wealthy and have a lot of freedom.
Right, and you disagree.
So you could pull out some statistics from, like, the World Happiness Report, which ranks countries based on various factors.
And you could point out that countries like Finland and Denmark consistently rank higher than the United States.
Exactly. Or you could cite studies that show that happiness isn't always directly correlated with wealth.
So you're basically using hard evidence to counter your friend's opinion.
Exactly. And most people won't argue with statistics or expert opinions, even if they don't fully understand them.
Okay, what's technique number 7?
This one is called two wrongs don't make a right.
Okay, but isn't that, like, a basic moral principle? How does that work as a technique?
Well, in this context, it's more about using it as a diversion tactic. So let's say you're being criticized for something you did. Maybe you made a mistake at work, or, I don't know, you said something hurtful to a friend.
And you don't want to admit you were wrong.
Right. So instead of apologizing or defending yourself, you bring up a time when the other person did something similar.
So you're basically deflecting the blame.
Exactly. You're trying to shift the focus away from your own wrongdoing by pointing out their past mistakes.
But, I mean, that doesn't really address the current issue, does it?
No, it doesn't. But it can be an effective way to derail the conversation and put the other person on the defensive.
I guess I can see that. So what's the next technique?
Technique number 8 is disclaimer.
Disclaimer. So, like, the fine print on a contract.
Kind of. It's about using polite introductory phrases to soften the blow of something you're about to say that might be rude or critical.
So, like, no offense, but.
Exactly. Or, I don't mean to be rude, but. Or, with all due respect. These phrases create a kind of buffer so you can say something potentially controversial without sounding too aggressive.
Okay, give me an example.
Let's say you're talking to a politician who's known for being corrupt.
Yeah.
And you want to confront them about it.
That could be a touchy situation.
Right. So instead of just accusing them outright, you might say something like, with all due respect, sir, but there have been a lot of allegations of corruption against you. How do you respond to those?
So you're still raising the issue, but you're doing it in a more diplomatic way.
Exactly. And the disclaimer helps to maintain a semblance of civility, even if the underlying message is quite critical.
Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these techniques are about, like, using language strategically to get what you want.
You're absolutely right. It's about being persuasive, even if that means bending the rules a little bit.
Well, let's see what the next technique is.
All right, technique number 9 is called apples vs. oranges.
Apples vs. oranges. That sounds familiar.
It's a pretty common saying, right?
Yeah.
Basically, it means comparing two things that are completely different. And in the context of arguments, it's a diversion tactic.
So, like, if you're losing an argument, you just change the subject.
Exactly. You bring up something completely unrelated, hoping to throw the other person off balance.
Okay, so let's say you're talking about, I don't know, the benefits of technology, and the other person just suddenly starts talking about animal cruelty.
Yeah, that's a classic example of apples vs. oranges. The two topics have nothing to do with each other, but the other person is trying to derail the conversation by introducing a completely different issue.
So how do you deal with that?
You call them out on it. You say, hey, wait a minute. We were talking about technology, not animal cruelty. Those are two different things.
So you're basically refusing to let them change the subject.
Exactly. You got to stay focused on the original argument. Otherwise, you'll just get lost in a sea of unrelated topics.
Okay, I can see that. What's technique number 10?
Technique number 10 is ad hominem attack.
Ad hominem? That sounds Latin or something.
It is. It basically means against the person. And in an argument, it means attacking the person making the argument rather than the argument itself.
So like name calling.
Yeah, that's one form of ad hominem attack. But it can also be more subtle, like bringing up someone's past mistakes or personal flaws to try to discredit them.
So it's like you can't trust anything this person says because they once cheated on their taxes kind of thing.
Exactly. It's a way of trying to undermine someone's credibility without actually addressing the substance of their argument.
And I'm guessing the best way to deal with this is to just ignore it and focus on the actual issue.
Exactly. Don't get sucked into defending yourself against personal attacks. Just stick to the facts and the logic of the argument.
Okay, what about technique number 11?
This one is anger, anger, go away.
Anger, go away. That sounds a little childish.
Well, the name might be a bit cheesy, but the principle behind it is actually quite powerful. It's about staying calm when the other person is losing their cool.
So like if someone's yelling and screaming, you just stay calm and collected.
Exactly. The idea is that anger often leads to mistakes and irrational behavior. If you can keep your cool while the other person is losing theirs, you'll automatically appear more reasonable and in control.
And I guess people are more likely to side with someone who's calm and rational.
Exactly. Plus, if you can stay calm, you'll be able to think more clearly and respond more effectively to their arguments.
Okay, that makes sense. What's technique number 12?
Technique number 12 is proverb.
Proverb, like a penny saved is a penny earned.
Exactly. This technique is about using well-known proverbs to support your arguments. Proverbs are like little nuggets of wisdom that have been passed down for generations, so they carry a certain weight of authority.
So like if someone's arguing that you should always take risks, you could counter with look before you leap.
Exactly. Or if someone's saying that you should never give up on your dreams, you could say, don't count your chickens before they hatch.
I see. So it's about using like traditional wisdom to back up your points.
Right. And the great thing about Proverbs is that there's one for almost every situation.
All right, what's technique number 13?
Technique number 13 is called loaded words.
Loaded words. What does that mean?
Loaded words are words that have strong emotional connotations, either positive or negative, and they can be used very effectively in arguments to sway people's opinions.
So like using words like freedom and justice to make your argument sound more appealing.
Exactly. Or using words like terrorist and dictator to make your opponent sound evil.
Okay, I can see how that would work. So give me an example.
Let's say you're talking about a controversial figure like Osho, and your friend calls him a cult leader or a fraud.
And you're a fan of Osho.
Right. So instead of arguing with them directly, you might say something like, Osho, the enlightened master, the man who brought peace and love to millions. I think you're misjudging him.
So you're using positive loaded words to create a more favorable image of Osho.
Exactly. And the other person is now forced to either argue against those positive descriptions or change the subject.
Okay, I can see how that could be effective. What's the next technique?
This one is called emotional versus logical.
Okay, so is this about appealing to people's hearts rather than their heads?
Exactly. Sometimes logic just isn't enough to win an argument. You need to connect with people on an emotional level.
So how do you do that?
Well, it depends on the situation, but some common tactics include using stories, anecdotes, metaphors, and even humor to make your argument more relatable and engaging.
Give me an example.
Okay, let's say you're a lawyer defending someone who's accused of a crime, and the evidence against them is pretty strong.
Sounds like a tough case.
It is. So instead of just focusing on the legal technicalities, you might tell a story about your client's difficult childhood or their struggles with addiction.
So you're trying to make the jury sympathize with your client.
Exactly. You're appealing to their emotions, their sense of compassion. And sometimes that can be more persuasive than any logical argument.
Okay, what's technique number 15?
Technique number 15 is condition first.
Condition first. What does that mean?
It means setting a condition before you're willing to engage in an argument. Basically, you're saying, I'll only discuss this with you if you first agree to.
So it's like a pre-negotiation tactic.
Exactly. It's a way of controlling the terms of the debate, and it can be very effective if you have a strong point that you want to make sure is addressed.
Okay, so let's say you're arguing with someone about Bill Clinton's presidency, and you think his affair with Monica Lewinsky is a major issue that needs to be addressed.
Right. So you might say, I'm happy to discuss Clinton's policies, but first we need to talk about the Lewinsky scandal. That's a fundamental issue of character that can't be ignored.
So you're basically making that a prerequisite for any further discussion.
Exactly. And the other person is now forced to either engage with that issue or back down from the argument altogether.
Okay, that's pretty clever. What's technique number 16?
Technique number 16 is seek and you shall find. Faulty logic.
So this is about identifying the flaws in the other person's reasoning.
Exactly. And there are a lot of common logical fallacies that people use, either intentionally or unintentionally.
Like what?
Well, one common one is the hasty generalization, where someone draws a conclusion based on a very small sample size.
So like, I met two people from France who were rude, so all French people must be rude.
Exactly. That's a hasty generalization.
Mm.
Another common fallacy is the straw man, where you misrepresent your opponent's argument to make it easier to attack.
So like, if someone says, we should invest more in education, and you respond with, so you want to raise taxes and bankrupt the country.
Right. That's a straw man argument. You're twisting their words to make them sound extreme.
Okay, I get it. So this technique is about being able to spot those fallacies and point them out.
Exactly. And it can be very effective in dismantling a weak argument. Of course, it also helps if you can avoid using those fallacies yourself.
Right, gotta play fair. Right, what's the next technique?
This one is called make a wager.
Make a wager. So like betting on the outcome of the argument.
Exactly. This technique is all about showing how confident you are in your position. If you're willing to put money on it, you must really believe in what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I guess so. But isn't that a bit risky?
It can be, but it
Yeah.
can also be very effective, especially if the other person is unsure of themselves.
So let's say you're arguing about, I don't know, who's going to win the next election,
Yeah.
and you're really confident in your prediction.
Right. You could say, I'm so sure of this, I'll bet you $100 that I'm right.
And that might make the other person hesitate.
Exactly. They might start to doubt their own position if you're that willing to put your money where your mouth is.
Okay, I can see how that could work. What's technique number 18?
Technique number 18 is called ask questions.
Ask questions. So instead of making statements, you just pepper the other person with questions.
Exactly. And the key is to ask questions that lead them towards your way of thinking.
So like leading questions.
Yeah, kind of. But it's more about asking questions that they can't easily answer without admitting that you're right.
Give me an example.
Okay, let's say your employee is asking for a raise, and you don't want to give them one.
Always a fun conversation.
Right. So instead of just saying no, you could ask them questions like, well, have you been meeting all your targets? Have you been going above and beyond? Have you been taking on extra responsibilities?
And the implication is that if they haven't been doing those things, they don't deserve a raise.
Exactly. You're making them justify their request without directly saying no.
Yeah. Okay, I can see how that could be a subtle way of getting your point across. What's the next technique?
This one is majority wins.
Majority wins. Isn't that like the basis of democracy?
It is. And it can also be a very effective technique in arguments. Basically, it's about appealing to the power of the crowd.
So like, if you're in a group discussion and most people agree with you, you're more likely to win the argument.
Exactly. People are naturally influenced by what others think, even if they don't consciously realize it.
So how do you use this technique in practice?
Well, let's say you're discussing a controversial topic, like gun control, and you're in favor of stricter gun laws.
Okay.
So you could state your position and then say something like, so how many of you agree with me? Raise your hand if you think we need stricter gun laws.
And if most people raise their hand, that strengthens your position.
Exactly. It creates a sense of momentum and makes it harder for the people who disagree to speak up.
Okay, I can see that. What's the final technique?
Technique number 20 is a two-parter: self-deprecation and sarcastic laughter.
So like making fun of yourself and laughing at the other person's arguments.
Kind of. It's about using humor to disarm your opponent and undermine their arguments.
So like if someone's attacking you personally, you could just make a joke about yourself.
Exactly. Let's say someone calls you stupid or incompetent. Instead of getting defensive, you could say something like, yeah, you're right. I'm so stupid. I can't even remember what I had for breakfast this morning.
So you're basically agreeing with them, but in a way that makes their insult seem ridiculous.
Exactly. And it also takes away their power because you're not giving them the reaction they were hoping for.
Okay, and what about sarcastic laughter?
That's for when someone says something that's just so absurd or ridiculous that it's not even worth arguing with.
So like if someone says the earth is flat.
Exactly. Just laugh at them. It shows that you don't take them seriously, and it can be a very effective way of shutting down a conversation.
So those are the 20 techniques.
Yeah.
Quite a range of strategies there.
It is. And Gupta emphasizes that these are just tools. You don't have to use all of them, and you don't have to use them all the time.
Right. It's about choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that the goal of argumentation isn't always to win. Sometimes it's more about understanding the other person's perspective and finding common ground.
That's a good point. But, it's still good to have these techniques in your back pocket just in case.
Absolutely. It's always good to be prepared.
So, to all our listeners out there, now that you've had a chance to dive deep into these 20 techniques from Vishal Gupta's book, think about how you might use them in your own life. Are there any techniques that you're already using without realizing it? Are there any that you'd like to try?
And perhaps more importantly, think about the ethics of argumentation. When is it okay to use these techniques? And when is it better to just walk away?
Yeah, those are some good questions to ponder. After all, winning an argument isn't always the most important thing. Sometimes it's better to just let it go and preserve the relationship.
Exactly. But hey, at least now you have some new tools to help you navigate those tricky conversations.
All right, that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
See you then.